If you think about it, there are not a lot of love stories in the Bible. You may not expect them, but I thought, I'm curious, let me Google love stories in the Bible, and the Bible Society listed 8, none of which, in my opinion, quite resemble a love story, and frankly, their list is bizarre. First, Adam and Eve. The Bible Society's explanation of their great love story is that they were content to be with just each other, as if there were anyone else. Next on their list, Abraham and Sarah, which, they explained, was because she loved him so much, she let him sleep with Hagar so he could have a child. No kidding, this is their explanation. Which, of course, you know already eventually made Sarah so jealous, she had Hagar and the child banished to the wilderness where they would die of hunger and thirst, except for the intervention of an angel. I mean, so far, this is not such a great list. It isn't any better, this next one. I was surprised to see they listed Jacob and his marriage to 2 women at the same time, the sisters, Leah and Rachel. I mean, what kind of love story is that? And King David made the list twice. That means it's only 2 of his 8 wives. First was his marriage to Michal, to whom he was married as second prize, after Saul broke the promise about David marrying his first daughter. And we are told that she loved him until she very famously loathed the very sight of him. And King David is listed the second time for his relationship with Bathsheba, whom he first met when spying on her from the rooftop. He summoned her. She got pregnant. So he had her husband killed to get him out of the way. Yeah, that's the classic stuff of biblical romance. Break out the chocolates and champagne. So enough of the list. But not surprisingly, there was no mention of the story of one of the greatest loves in the Bible, Jonathan and David. David and Jonathan were first introduced on the day David carried the severed head of giant Goliath to King Saul. Saul was Jonathan's father. The book of 1 Samuel chapter 18 begins, as soon as David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan's soul became bound up with David's soul, and Jonathan loved David as much as himself. Saul then told David to stay instead of returning to his family. And the next verse says, and Jonathan and David made a covenant together because Jonathan loved David as much as himself. And then Jonathan took off his robe, gave it to David along with his armor, sword, bow, and his belt. We have twice in 3 verses, Jonathan loved David as much as himself. And those are not words found very much in Scripture. And he didn't just admire him. Jonathan's soul became bound up with David's soul. And it's certainly unusual to describe a covenant together in the Bible based on love. Jonathan and David made a covenant together because Jonathan loved David. Most covenants were transactional, and marriages were often more like business deals. Few of them were described as having anything to do with love. And then finally, as a sign of their covenant, as if it's a ritual, Jonathan took off his robe and presented it to David along with his armor, sword, bow, and belt, which is a symbolic act of ultimate vulnerability. This doesn't mean they were lovers in the way that we think about it 2,500 years later. And it doesn't mean they're gay in the way that we think about it 2,500 years later. But in a Bible that has very few examples of love and intimacy, boy, this sure stands out as significant. In fact, it's the kind of covenantal love that we aspire to 2,500 years later. And if we have any doubt about how David felt, was it the same way? In today's passage, mourning his death, David said, "I grieve for you, my brother Jonathan. You were so dear to me. Your love was more amazing to me than the love of women." So the story is in between the beginning and the end of this here. It's all about Jonathan protecting David, attempting to protect him. Dangerous defiance of his father, who was murderously jealous. And while David was in hiding, they often met secretly. And they are tender scenes described in surprisingly intimate ways. When Saul discovered their relationship, he exploded in rage. "You son of a perverse, rebellious woman! Do I not know that you have chosen the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of your mother's nakedness?" Jonathan protected David at substantial risk to his own life because that's the very covenant he promised. Because he loved him. Now, is there a story of love? Yes, of course. Is it a love story? Now, the attempts to downplay the significance of their relationship are predictable. To their credit, most translations stay faithful to the line, "Your love was more amazing to me than the love of women." However, some try to massage that a little. One translation, the same verse, says, "I enjoyed your friendship so much." Another said, "As the mother loveth her only son, so did I love thee." Where did that come from in that verse? And even Eugene Peterson disappoints me here. I usually like how he translates the Message, but he says, "Your friendship was a miracle wonder, love far exceeding anything I've known or ever hope to know." But no, verse 26 says, "Your love was more wonderful to me than even that of women." And to their credit, again, most translations get that right. Whew, but most commentators attempt to claim with righteous indignation that anything suggesting David and Jonathan were more than two good buddies is blasphemous. Any suggestion of more is met with, "How dare you?" But again, I'm not trying to make a comparison to our modern sensibilities. So I didn't hear this story in Sunday school, did you? But surprisingly, the first time I heard this story of Jonathan and David was from my mother. I remember the exact moment. We were standing in front of the kitchen sink in our new home in Grand Forks. It was the summer of my high school graduation, and I'd been accepted into an international choir to tour Europe and sing in some of the most amazing venues, including the cathedral in Cologne, which the reverb in that place is like 10 seconds. Anyway, during our week of rehearsals, we got to know each other and quickly became friends for this adventure of a lifetime. And along the way, there was one particular choir member to whom I felt some kind of weird connection. Strong, not weird. I didn't know that at the time. It was unlike anything. And to my surprise, the feeling was mutual. About 2 weeks in, on our first night in Paris, the group went on a river cruise, and after dinner, we would visit the Eiffel Tower. I started having stomach pain during the cruise, and it was decided that I should stay back in the hotel. And my friend asked to stay with me and sacrifice seeing the Eiffel Tower. Now, doctors in France, at the time at least, came and did house calls. And so one came to the hospital and he couldn't find anything wrong. But an hour or two later, it was much worse, and another doctor was summoned, and then he touched my right side of the abdomen, and I shot up to the ceiling in pain. And I did see the Eiffel Tower that night, in the distance, as we rushed by taxi to the hospital. my friend right by my side, holding my hand all the way there and in the room as we waited. My parents got a call in the middle of the night to go wire $2,000 so I could have surgery. The next day, the choir moved on to Belgium, and my friend begged to stay back, but the leaders wouldn't let him. But if I could get strong enough in 3 days, I could return from Amsterdam with him and the group, and believe me, I did. We got back to the U.S. My parents came to pick us up in Fargo, and we begged that they let him come home with me and explained, well, he can ride the bus. It's only a 6-hour ride from our house to his, which meant that his parents drove to Fargo back and forth, which from their home was 14 hours round trip. But they agreed. And then a few weeks later, as I stood in front of that kitchen window washing dishes in our new home in Grand Forks, I begged my mom to let me take the bus to see him. And she looked at me curiously. And she said, "You two sound like Jonathan and David." I said, "Who are they?" She explained that they were two friends in the Bible who had an extraordinarily close relationship. So I found my Bible, and wow. And it had only been a month or two before that also for the first time, I read a very different passage in the Bible. I had discovered, men shall not lie with men, and it terrified me. I was a teenager, trying to put together the pieces of who I was, and this was absolutely not who I wanted to be. And that night, I got down on my knees on brown shag carpet in the basement, and I prayed so hard that this would not be true. And then here we were, a couple of months later, and my mom told me about Jonathan and David. Now, at the time, I didn't put two and two together, but today I look back and just marvel at how God works in our lives, how God answered that prayer very unexpectedly and wonderfully. Now, I know others might not or refuse to see this in this way, but when I read the story of Jonathan and David, it's like looking in a mirror and seeing myself reflected back in Scripture. It's powerful. And we may disagree about this interpretation, but just recognize that the covenant between David and Jonathan was based on love. An extraordinarily rare form of covenant between two people of any sex in the Bible. Just, if you have a problem with it, just make love the story. Read into it, don't read into it, but it's certainly more of a love story than Adam and Eve. So there's one last piece to the story of Jonathan and David. After Jonathan died, David didn't just move on and forget about him, like a phase, a memory from his youth. So Jonathan had a disabled son. He was paraplegic. David took him in and raised him as his own son and said, "For the sake of your father Jonathan, you will always eat at my table." Their souls were indeed knit together, both in life and in death. On this Sunday before Pride, I hope this inspires you to remember that the Bible is so much more than passages that get used like weapons to hurt and divide. On Saturday, as hate-filled demonstrators line the parade route, trying to denigrate and demean same-gender loving people, you know that even in the Bible, love comes in so many more forms than anyone can imagine or judge. Because truly in God's house, love is love, is love, is love, is love, is love. Love is love, thank God.